Established as a fundamental pillar in aviation in the northwest of the country in the early 70s, Portland International Airport was an important hub for domestic and international flights. A great reputation that was to be put to the test that Thanksgiving Eve. Not just because of the thousands of passengers that would flood its newly opened terminal, but for hosting the first act of a story that is still being written. In the late morning, a middle-aged man approached the Northwest Airlines counters to purchase a one-way ticket to Seattle. He paid the $20 fare in cash and gave the name Dan Cooper for his ticket. In an era when boarding a plane was not much harder than getting on a bus, no one checked his name or the contents of his black briefcase. Cooper, dressed in a dark overcoat and suit, white shirt, black tie, and dark shoes, boarded Flight 305 and, after calmly sitting in seat 18E at the rear of the plane, put on dark sunglasses. Without any incident, the plane took off at 12:50 p.m. Even though it was a flight of just half an hour, this Dan asked the flight attendant, a 23-year-old woman named Florence Schaffner, for a bourbon to accompany the cigarette he had just lit. When the young woman returned with the drink, she received a note from this polite and mysterious man. Used to passengers giving them their phone numbers, she pocketed it without any intention of reading it. A gesture that, apparently, did not sit well with Dan. Because as soon as he had the chance, he whispered a simple, chilling sentence into her ear. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." If it was a pickup line, it was certainly a rather strange one, so she sat down to see what this crazy man had to say. Once beside him, he slowly and silently opened the briefcase to reveal 8 dynamite cylinders connected to a detonator he was holding in his hand. It was clear that this man was not interested in flirting. This Dan Cooper was hijacking the plane. With the confidence that comes from having several pounds of dynamite in your seat, he began to list his demands. He wanted $200,000 in US currency, which today would be equivalent to $1.2 million, delivered inside a backpack, and 4 parachutes. Those were the gifts he demanded for Christmas. Now she had to communicate them to the pilots so they could speak to Santa Claus. Meanwhile, a second flight attendant, a 21-year-old named Tina Mucklow, sat next to him, forced to act as an intermediary between Cooper and the cockpit, who had already contacted air traffic control, who in turn was speaking with local and federal authorities. Northwest Airlines Flight 305 had been hijacked. However, the United States does not negotiate with terrorists, or at least that's what they say in the movies, because in an hour and a half they had already gathered the $200,000 and the 4 parachutes that a man with sunglasses and explosives had requested. The flight, which was initially supposed to last half an hour, had now stretched to 2 hours, but none of the 35 passengers on that Boeing 727 were aware that they had been hijacked. As the captain had communicated over the intercom, they were waiting for a minor mechanical issue to be resolved. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle Airport, more than a mile from the terminal. The ransom money and the 4 parachutes were first delivered to Tina, who handed them over to Cooper inside the plane. The windows were completely closed. No one had a view of the hijacker. Moments later, all the passengers disembarked, only to be met by a horde of 100 journalists. The news of the hijacked flight had reached the media before those just meters away from Cooper. The crew had not informed them to avoid panic, but now they couldn't escape spending Thanksgiving being interrogated by the FBI. Back on the plane, it was now empty except for the flight crew and Cooper, who was angry because his wish list had not been followed to the letter. He had specifically requested that the $200,000 be placed inside a backpack. Instead, they had arrived in a poor and sad cloth bag without any closure. To top it off, the refueling was taking longer than expected, because he had no intention of getting off the plane. They were going to take off again and fly to Mexico City, but with very special, and to the pilots, strange and dangerous conditions. The plane had to fly at the lowest possible altitude, no higher than 3 kilometers. The landing gear had to remain down. The wing flaps had to point downward. Pressurizing the fuselage was forbidden, and the speed could not exceed 400 kilometers per hour. Despite the danger of these conditions, the dynamite was even more dangerous, so the pilots agreed. The only thing they couldn't give him was that direct flight to Mexico. If he wanted to fly that way, it was impossible to reach without refueling a second time. Therefore, they agreed to make a stop halfway in Reno, Nevada. With Cooper's patience running low, with the plane parked for almost 2 hours due to complications with the refueling, finally, at 7:40 p.m., the plane took off from Seattle, heading into the cold night and dense storm clouds. Barely 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper asked Tina, who had been with him the whole time, to retreat to the cockpit, and from that moment on, no one was to disturb or interrupt him. Everyone had to lock themselves in and leave him alone. Around 8, a warning light illuminated on the control panel, alerting the crew that the rear stairway had been deployed. Through the intercom, the crew asked Cooper if he needed assistance, to which he responded with the last message they would hear from him: a simple no. Minutes later, at exactly 8:12 p.m., everyone in the cockpit felt a strong decompression. Their ears popped forcefully. It was evident that the rear door of the plane, the one leading to the stairs, had been opened. Silence and tense peace reigned for the next 3 hours until they finally landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport and cautiously ventured into the fuselage, only to find what they had all suspected. The door was still open and the rear stairway was deployed. There was no trace of the money, the bomb, or that Dan Cooper. There was only one explanation. At some point between Seattle and Reno, he had put on one of the parachutes, descended the stairs, and jumped into the abyss. Cooper had escaped from the plane, venturing into the dark night with a $200,000 ransom. He had pulled off the perfect hijacking. As soon as it was clear that Cooper was no longer on board, dozens of FBI agents searched the plane, only to find a disappointing amount of physical evidence. All that remained of the hijacker were 2 of the 4 parachutes, 8 cigarette butts, and his black clip-on tie. All hopes then were placed on the testimony of those who had shared the flight with him. The passengers, and especially the 2 flight attendants, Tina and Florence, had more than 2 hours to memorize Cooper's face. He was described as a white male with brown eyes and dark hair, around 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, and no more than 180 pounds. Additionally, he was said to speak like an intelligent person without any particular accent, which generally indicates someone from the Midwest United States. Based on the testimonies from that same night, they were able to create the first series of composite sketches of the hijacker. They had the image of this Dan Cooper, a man who had just jumped from a Boeing with a haul of $200,000, the FBI's most wanted man. Immediately before the first light of day, eager to report what could be the story of the century, hundreds of journalists fought for an exclusive on the case. The sketch became the most coveted item in their world, and chaos took over that airport. So much so that while the authorities were reviewing records, a journalist who overheard the name D.B. Cooper, someone simply mentioned by the agents but never connected as a suspect, used that alias to refer to the hijacker. Dan Cooper had become D.B. Cooper due to a careless reporter. With that pseudonym, he emerged as a media phenomenon. That same morning, everyone learned about the news, unleashing a hurricane in the country and providing a topic of conversation for Thanksgiving dinner in millions of American households. Moreover, D.B. Cooper's sketch was so basic that it sparked enormous paranoia. He didn't look like anyone, and at the same time, he looked like everyone. the FBI received thousands of calls, with people even accusing their family and friends of being the hijacker, but none provided relevant information. With all of America turned into detectives, it was evident they had to go out there and find him. The hijacking case of Flight 305 was dubbed NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, and everything depended on mounting a search operation. A deployment in the possible landing zone to catch the man everyone now knew as DB Cooper. With the flight route, if they could determine the exact time he jumped from the plane, they should be able to identify the area where he landed. The problem was figuring out those points in space and time. None of the 4 crew members saw Cooper jump, nor did the pilots of the 2 fighter jets that escorted the plane from its takeoff in Seattle, which is normal considering they were flying in a storm at night. Without that visual contact, it seemed impossible to know the when of that equation. However, the flight members reported something strange, that decompression in their ears at 8:12 p.m. The vibration in the plane had to come from Cooper opening the door to jump. Even if he took a moment before plunging into the void, they had an approximate time. But time alone was worthless. Although Cooper was very explicit about the flight conditions, he wasn't at all about the route. He only demanded to fly to Mexico City and, failing that, to Reno. In this situation, the captain decided to follow Victor 23, a navigational airway used for flying specific routes under visual flight rules, a sort of highway in the skies that crosses over southwestern Washington state. With that route and the time point, the agents estimated that the flight's location at the time of the jump would be about 25 miles north of Portland. Nonetheless, there were so many variables to consider, like the wind itself that could have diverted him during the descent, that the perimeter was immense. Not to mention that by the time they were ready to deploy the operation, Cooper already had a 40-hour head start. Helicopters, planes, and ground troops. The deployment was unprecedented. Dozens of soldiers patrolled the terrain. A cold, mountainous region of very dense forest. Under those conditions, the search area was so relatively wide, about 25 miles in diameter, that gradually hopes began to fade. Despite all efforts, they found no evidence. There was no trace of Cooper, the money, or the parachute. All they had achieved from that search was turning an aircraft hijacking case into a legend. DB Cooper had become a national hero, an American tale, the anti-hero fighting against the system. That cultural legacy of famous bandits and bank robbers resurrected through Cooper. In a society historically fascinated by those who break the rules and living through a tough economic situation, he was seen as a sort of Robin Hood. By late December, merchandising began to be distributed across the country and movies and documentaries dramatizing the case started being produced. Meanwhile, the FBI, having ended the ground search, turned its attention to the money. The ransom money was collected from the National Bank of Seattle, 10,000 $20 bills whose serial numbers had been recorded before being handed over to Cooper. They took photographs of every single bill, allowing them to track where, when, and how the money would be spent. Besides being made public, the full list was given to all financial institutions, government agencies, and casinos in the country. Northwest Airlines also offered a reward to any citizen who found a bill with a matching serial number. The Willy Wonka golden ticket of air hijackings. But despite this, no one ever found any of those bills. The ransom money seemed to have never been spent anywhere in the United States. This reinforced all the rumors that had circulated within the FBI from the beginning. The intuition that he did not survive that leap of faith into the abyss. The lines of investigation pointed to Cooper having a military background and extensive parachuting training. In conversations with the flight attendants, he showed knowledge of aviation and aeronautical engineering. knowing that the Boeing 727 had that particular rear stairway that provided a relatively safe escape route. He remained calm at all times to avoid panic among passengers. In a smart move, he demanded 4 parachutes so the agents would think he intended to jump with hostages and avoid giving him a sabotaged one. But despite all that, we are talking about a human being jumping into the void from 10,000 feet high in the middle of the night, in late November, and in the middle of a storm dressed in a simple suit and shirt. The speed of the free fall, the wind, and the rain would have generated a wind chill of -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Even assuming the feat of surviving the descent under those conditions, one must consider that the parachute he used could not be steered. He would be at the mercy of air currents falling over a dense forest with trees turned into sharp weapons. And even imagining he were a superhero and survived this too, Cooper would find himself in the middle of nowhere with nothing to orient himself in that darkness. With the faint hope of finding a path back to civilization, after traversing miles and miles of forest. The hypothesis that D.B. Cooper did not survive his escape gained strength over time. Although the mystery remained as to why his body or any of his belongings were never found in such an extensive search, the consensus began to form that whoever that man was, jumping from the plane was the last thing he did in his life. At least until much later, we found something that rewrote the history of what had already become the only unsolved air hijacking in United States history. Eight years after the hijacking and disappearance of D.B. Cooper, with the FBI exploring countless paths that always led to dead ends, the turning point in the investigation came from the hands of an 8-year-old boy. Brian Ingram was playing on the shore of the Columbia River, on a small beach known as Tina Bar. Digging in the sand to build a campfire, the boy unearthed 3 bundles of $20 bills. They totaled $5,800, and the serial numbers matched those of the money given to D.B. Cooper that night, in November 1971. The discovery generated massive media noise, reigniting interest in a case that seemed destined to have no new leads or avenues for investigation. The bills were in very poor condition, but they still had their rubber bands and were in the same order as when they were taken from the bank. Even so, far from answering old questions, all it did was generate new ones. Tina Bar was about 30 kilometers from the initial search area where they knew, with considerable certainty, that Cooper had jumped. And it might be tempting to think that simply part of the loot fell into the river to end up on the shores of that beach. The problem, and not a minor one, is that the Columbia River flows in the opposite direction. Either the money swam upstream, or there was something more behind its discovery. The first hypothesis was that they needed to reevaluate the jump zone. If it had occurred more to the southeast than they thought, it was plausible to imagine the money being deposited in the Washougal River, a tributary of the Columbia River, whose flow would allow it to end up at Tina Bar. Even so, these natural explanations cannot explain why 3 independent bundles of bills, floating freely for what could be several kilometers of river, ended up deposited together on the same beach. To complicate matters further, excavations in the sand at Tina Bar showed that the bills were found above a layer of sediment that settled years after the plane hijacking. This meant that the money was buried sometime after 1974. For all these reasons, the most plausible explanation the FBI could come up with was that the bills were deliberately deposited. They didn't know if by Cooper himself, who thus survived the leap of faith, or by another person who found his loot and never reported it to the authorities. Since the discovery at Tina Bar, the land around the beach and the Washougal River has been extensively inspected. But just like 8 years earlier, the search yielded no results. Cooper, whose legend was strengthening over time, had vanished again. turned into a myth of American popular culture, thousands of case enthusiasts began to act as investigators, eventually finding a path that had not been considered by any intelligence agency in the country. A path that placed Cooper outside the United States and led to Canada. Dan Cooper, the name the hijacker used before the journalistic era, was also the name of the protagonist of a popular French comic series. A pilot of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the central figure of The Adventures of Dan Cooper, created by Belgian artist Albert Weinberg. The comics were only written in French and were very popular in Belgium, France, and French-speaking Canada in the 1960s and 1970s, but were not known among English speakers. Inspecting all the volumes, case enthusiasts found many parallels with the hijacking by D.B. Cooper. There were several similar stories. A plane ticket with the name Dan Cooper appeared, the story of a plane hijacking in Seattle, a Boeing 727, and the protagonist dressing very similarly to the real Cooper. They were claiming that this man had been inspired by the 41 comics in the series to craft the character he was going to portray. Something that might be a mere curiosity were it not for the fact that it led the investigation to the neighboring country. D.B. Cooper could be a Canadian citizen. Something that would also explain why the bills never appeared in the United States. Starting in the 1960s, the budget of the Canadian Air Force was greatly reduced. A trend that peaked in 1965, 6 years before the hijacking, when they decided to lay off 500 pilots without offering them any reintegration program. If D.B. Cooper was a pilot in the Canadian Force or a military technician victim of those layoffs, there was a motive. Someone who, as the flight attendants reported, had resentment towards something or someone and wanted to make a hit to retire. Given that it is difficult to distinguish the Canadian accent, it is possible that Cooper, described as someone without any specific accent, was a bilingual Canadian. The hypothesis could make sense. It was possible that he was a person from Canada who took the name and inspiration from that comic series, but it was equally possible that he was American and had the idea to call himself Dan Cooper by simple chance. The male population in 1971 in Canada was almost 11 million people. They couldn't investigate them all, and above all, they couldn't make reading a comic a crime. After this promising but insufficient line of investigation, many years passed before new evidence emerged. In 2007, 36 years after that historic night, a team of scientists investigated one of the only physical pieces of evidence obtained from the plane. When the plane landed in Reno, the FBI found and archived the black clip-on tie that Cooper, in an incomprehensible action given the meticulousness of his plan, left on the fuselage. And so much later, with forensic technology having evolved enormously, it could hold new hope. Scientists inspected Cooper's tie using a scanning electron microscope, which surprisingly revealed the presence of particles of rare metals such as pure titanium, cerium, and strontium sulfide. These metals are unusual in civilian applications but are used in the manufacture of aircraft and high-tech aerospace and chemical equipment. The most interesting of all was the titanium because it was commercially pure titanium. It was not any alloy like those usually used in the aerospace sector in 1971. It had to come from R&D departments experimenting with this material. A discovery that, although it seemed impossible, gave strength to the theory born from that comic. It is known that Canadair, a manufacturer of civilian and military aircraft based in Canada, was working with pure titanium in the construction of 2 planes in the period immediately before the hijacking, the CT-114 Tutor and the CT-133 Silver Star. If Cooper had worked at the company, or had been a military man who used one of those aircraft, everything fit. The presence of those metals on his tie, the disappearance of the bills from circulation on US soil, the name Dan Cooper, due to the success of the comic among all those related to the Canadian military, and even the strange specification at the time of the hijacking that he wanted the $200,000 in US currency. something that made no sense to specify if he was from the country. The discovery of titanium on the tie sparked a second golden age in the story of D.B. Cooper, one that coincided with the rise of the internet era, something that made the investigation largely fall into the hands of individuals. Enthusiasts contributing to the case by providing scientific knowledge, reviewing thousands of public domain FBI documents, and even working on the ground in the hope of finding clues that for more than 3 decades had hidden from the intelligence agency's view. This collective effort led to the discovery that at the start of the case, the FBI contacted the Royal Canadian Air Force requesting an inspection of their military bases. But in Cold War times and with tense relations between the United States and Canada, they did not allow US services to investigate the case on their land. From the beginning, the FBI knew that many leads pointed to Canada, but none of them were investigated. An easily explainable fact due to the military secrecy of the Cold War, which however shook the foundations of the communities of case enthusiasts. The story of D.B. Cooper through the internet began to be closely related to conspiracy theories. Forums filled with hypotheses that, although implausible, demonstrated the fascination and mystery the case aroused in people. Cooper being a Soviet spy who stole the money to fund clandestine operations. Cooper having connections to the mafia and carrying out the hijacking to settle a debt. An inside job with Cooper being a government agent carrying out the operation as part of a covert plan. And even a tremendous ending with Cooper being abducted by aliens after jumping from the plane. In the era where everyone has to have an opinion and defend it to the death, conspiracy theories became anchored to the legend of the case. The dream of uncovering a truth hidden by those who supposedly pull the strings of the world is one of the great concerns and motivations of the American population. And the whole case around D.B. Cooper is just a small example of this global dynamic. But amid the inevitable whirlwind of misinformation, some paths have indeed led to places where perhaps all the answers around the Enigma rest. The faces that may hide the identity of the fugitive of the skies. Half a century has passed since the night that the strangest chapter in the history of American aviation was written. During all that time, the FBI has investigated and interrogated over 1,000 people, but only a few remain in the spotlight as suspects of being D.B. Cooper, the person behind the infamous legend. The first major name is Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., who became a suspect in 1972 on his own merits. McCoy was a Vietnam veteran and an expert parachutist, matching the skills necessary for the jump from that plane. But it wasn't his military past that made him a suspect. What has immortalized his name in history is that he was literally a copycat of Cooper. On April 7, 1972, just 5 months after the incident, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines plane in Denver, Colorado, with a modus operandi very similar to Cooper's. Using the false name of James Johnson and importantly with a hand grenade on board, he demanded $500,000, which was delivered to him in Los Angeles. Once airborne again, he parachuted from the plane near Provo, Utah. However, this time, the FBI discovered his true identity, and upon searching his home, they found the $500,000. McCoy was immediately arrested and sentenced to 45 years in prison. The parallels were undeniable, and in fact it seemed some aspects of the hijacking had been perfected. Either he was Cooper's #1 fan, or he was essentially D.B. Cooper. The hypothesis of McCoy being that national anti-hero gained traction, but there were significant arguments against it. Witnesses of Cooper's hijacking described a man with characteristics different from McCoy, who was 29 years old at the time. Cooper was described as a man in his 40s. Furthermore, McCoy, as reported by the flight attendants and passengers, was very nervous throughout the event. He left a handwritten note, something Cooper was smart enough to avoid, and a magazine he read on the plane, leaving perfectly identifiable fingerprints that led the FBI to him. Additionally, there is a substantial amount of evidence, especially from phone records, placing McCoy in Las Vegas on the day of Cooper's hijacking and in Utah with his family the day after for Thanksgiving dinner. Regardless, 2 years after his imprisonment, McCoy escaped, only to be found again 3 months later and die in a shootout with FBI agents, thus closing any possibility of progress in the case. To this day, McCoy's connection to Cooper is not ruled out but remains controversial. The second name on this list of suspects is Jack Kofelt. A famous con artist and ex-convict, he claimed to have been D.B. Cooper in a 1972 interview, saying he organized the hijacking with the help of an accomplice and that much of the $200,000 went to fund illegal operations, hence why it wasn't found in circulation. Kofelt's theory gained credibility solely because he bore a resemblance to the sketch of Cooper. Was in Portland on the day of the hijacking, and there are records of him suffering leg injuries sometime after the incident. However, his story had numerous inconsistencies with the FBI's confidential information, and he never provided concrete evidence to support his claims. Despite his criminal background and an obvious penchant for deceit, there was no solid evidence linking him to the hijacking of Flight 305. In fact, in the following years, it came to light that Kofelt just wanted to sell his story to a movie producer, something he continued to try until his death in 1975. Hollywood didn't buy his tale, and the inconsistencies have led most investigators to not consider him a serious suspect today. The third name is Robert Rackstraw, a military veteran with experience in parachuting and special operations. His military background, knowledge, and skills matched those necessary to execute both the hijacking and the jump. In the early 70s, Rackstraw was accused of multiple crimes, including fraud and forgery, as well as illegal possession of explosives, and, although never convicted, accused of murdering his stepfather. With a peculiar and notable ability to evade authorities in 1978, he was investigated by the FBI as a possible suspect in the D.B. Cooper case. Rackstraw had an uncle named John Cooper, from whom he might have taken the surname, and he was expelled from the army just a few months before the hijacking, which could suggest a motive of resentment towards the United States. When approached by journalists and private detectives, he never confirmed nor denied being D.B. Cooper. Still, while the infamous hijacker was said to have brown eyes, Rackstraw had blue eyes. Not to mention, at the time of the incident, he was only 28 years old. With no physical evidence directly linking Rackstraw to the case, the FBI dismissed him as a suspect in 1979 due to a lack of conclusive proof. He remains an intriguing name, but there has never been a clear conclusion against him. Opinions on his guilt remain divided. The fourth name is Barbara Dayton. Born Robert Dayton, she was a World War II veteran and pilot. After the war, she underwent gender reassignment surgery in 1969, becoming the first person in Washington state to undergo such a procedure. Sometime in the mid-70s, Barbara confessed to friends that she had carried out the Northwest Airlines hijacking to start a new life, with her experience as a pilot providing the necessary knowledge to execute the crime after disguising herself. Although the confession was intriguing, she didn't provide physical evidence to support her story. Additionally, certain details of the account were questioned. And despite some family members saying the sketch resembled her and noting that her personal diary was empty on November 24, 1971, there was no evidence linking her to the hijacking. Today, Barbara Dayton being the true identity of D.B. Cooper is a fascinating theory due to the background and confession, but the lack of evidence and inconsistencies in the story prevent a definitive conclusion about her involvement in the incident. The fifth name is Ted Braden. He enlisted in the Army at just 16 years old and was a veteran of World War II and the Vietnam War, as well as a member of the Green Berets, the U.S. Army Special Forces. He had extensive experience in covert missions and parachuting, having performed over 900 jumps in his career. He was known for being highly skilled in escape techniques and survival, something Cooper would surely have needed upon landing. In December 1966, Braden committed the capital offense of desertion, abandoning his unit in Vietnam and traveling to Congo to work as a mercenary for hire. Shortly thereafter, he was captured by the CIA and repatriated to the United States to be court-martialed in 1967. After this, details of his life become more obscure. Apparently, he dedicated his life to crime until being incarcerated in 1980. His parachuting skills and special operations experience, along with his tendency to operate outside military norms, made him a possible suspect, especially upon discovering that he was working as a truck driver near Portland at the time of the hijacking. His physical description matched in many aspects, although he was somewhat shorter than the testimonies detailed. Regardless, the factor of resentment towards the United States for what he believed ruined his life with the court-martial made him a strong suspect. It was even possible that during his time in Congo he discovered the Dan Cooper comics, as it was a former Belgian colony where French is the official language. Nonetheless, once again, no physical evidence could be gathered to link him to the hijacking. Ted Braden remains an interesting suspect due to his exquisite skills and rebellious behavior towards U.S. institutions. But the lack of evidence has also prevented a definitive conclusion. The sixth name is Dwayne Weber, one of the most mentioned suspects in modern investigation. In 1995, as a deathbed confession, Dwayne told his wife Jo that he was D.B. Cooper. This statement led the woman to thoroughly investigate his past. He was also a World War II veteran, but lived a double life, one as an insurance salesman and the other as a professional criminal, having been arrested 16 times between 1945 and 1968, serving time in prison at least 6 times. Jo recalled details in their life that now made sense, like once finding a Northwest Airlines ticket that Dwayne said he couldn't remember when it was from or where he had flown. She even recounted a night he spoke in his sleep about fleeing from a plane. Similarly, she claimed that in 1979 they spent an afternoon at Tina Bar, the same place where $5,800 was found buried in the sand a year later. Although the FBI investigated the woman's claims, they found insufficient evidence to confirm her husband was D.B. Cooper. There were only circumstantial pieces of evidence. Officially, Dwayne Weber was removed from the suspect list in 1998, but the door remains open. His involvement in the hijacking remains an interesting yet unconfirmed hypothesis. The seventh name is Kenneth Christensen, who appeared on the suspect list for the first time in 2003, after his brother accused him of being the hijacker following his death. He was a paratrooper in World War II and worked as a flight attendant for Northwest Airlines, the airline involved in the hijacking. His brother Lyle spoke of supposedly credible evidence indicating he could be Cooper, such as ambiguous comments about a large sum of money, increased spending by Kenneth after the incident, and a newspaper clipping about the hijacking, and that he smoked and liked bourbon. That was all the evidence. Kenneth resembled the descriptions of the hijacker, but with no physical evidence linking him to the incident, the FBI never considered him a prime suspect. Nevertheless, Lyle wanted to capitalize on the story. With his brother dead and unable to complain, he hired a private detective to write a supposedly factual book about Kenneth's involvement in the hijacking. It wasn't a bestseller, but it generated enough buzz for a certain program on a certain network to produce an entire episode featuring him as the prime suspect in the case. From there, people found connections that, with effort, could tie anyone to Cooper. Today, the story of Kenneth Christensen is just a popular theory. The eighth name is Sheridan Peterson. An experienced smoke jumper and ex-Marine, He also worked in Seattle as a Boeing engineer, which gave him technical knowledge about the planes used by Northwest Airlines, having been in the department that wrote the manual for the 727. He was introduced to the list of suspects in 2007 when DNA analysis on Cooper's tie revealed a partial match with his. Although it was only partial and did not serve as evidence, his background drew the agent's attention to him. Sheridan claimed to have been in Nepal at the time of the hijacking, although only his second wife, who passed away in 1977, could confirm his alibi. Even so, beyond his capabilities and certain resemblance to the sketches, the FBI found no direct evidence linking him to the incident. Today, his involvement is possible, but not at all a confirmed theory. The ninth and last name is Lynn Doyle Cooper. In 2011, Marla Cooper, the suspect's niece, claimed that on Thanksgiving Day 1971, her uncle returned to her grandmother's house with injuries he said were from a car accident, but she now believed were from being involved in the hijacking. 40 years later, she was recounting what she remembered seeing at 8 years old, a questionable testimony that nonetheless caused much media noise. She also said that Lynn was obsessed with Dan Cooper comics and that the descriptions and behavior of the hijacker matched her uncle. Apparently, shortly after the hijacking, Lynn disappeared, and no one in the family ever heard from him again. But beyond that, a last name and a childhood memory from 40 years prior, there was no evidence. Moreover, if Lynn had any experience with parachuting, it certainly wasn't at the level necessary to perform such a maneuver. The FBI considered the woman's claims, but no conclusive evidence supporting Lynn Doyle Cooper's involvement was found. Once again, they had reached a dead end. 4 decades trying to find that definitive clue. One more name added to an endless list. The few remaining hopes of solving the case, of revealing the identity of a hijacker who most likely would not even be alive anymore, gradually faded over the decade. The outcome was clear. They were just prolonging the inevitable. Therefore, on July 8, 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI officially closed the case. The agency decided to reallocate resources to other more priority cases than the hijacking of a plane half a century ago. They would keep evidence related to the case, but no longer investigate new or old suspects. The D.B. Cooper hijacking was officially the first and only unsolved aerial hijacking in U.S. history. Today, 53 years after that night, we are no closer to finding an answer. The incident has become enshrined as the holy grail of unsolved cases. So much time later, it's no longer about Cooper or any of the hundreds of suspects. This is now the story of all those who have dedicated and continue to dedicate their lives to finding him. With something that revives the hope of giving an identity to that lifeless image. We all need answers. Stories without an end are an unbearable source of frustration. The case is a story whose last sentence was never written. An incomplete tale. The tale of a certain Dan Cooper who decided to hijack a plane. What cannot be denied is that at least he did it with style.